What do the Gospels say directly about being gay? Keep watching to find out. Okay, so here's everything that the Gospels say directly about being gay. Oh, sorry, that's it. The Gospels say nothing directly about being gay. Now, there's plenty in the Gospels which speaks indirectly, but that's not the focus of this video. People on both sides of the issue argue that the Gospels do speak pretty directly about being gay, so why do I disagree? Sometimes both sides appeal to what Jesus would do or say. For example, those on the affirming side sometimes say Jesus accepted everybody, therefore Jesus accepts gay and lesbian people. Well, yes, but those on the non-affirming side say he also told people to stop sinning. So if you think that it is sinful to have intercourse with someone the same gender as yourself, then you're not going to be impressed by this argument. Those on the non-affirming side sometimes argue Jesus was a first-century Jew, any first-century Jew would condemn homosexuality, therefore Jesus would and does condemn homosexuality. Well, yes, but Jesus isn't just any first-century Jew. He's different. He's God. Without that, we don't have Christianity, we don't have the Gospels. So this type of logic, this type of argument isn't particularly helpful. Then there's arguments from silence. Those on the affirming side sometimes argue Jesus didn't say anything against homosexuality, he didn't condemn it, and therefore it must be okay. Well, there's loads of things we don't have a record of Jesus condemning, including slavery. Doesn't necessarily make them right. But those on the non-affirming side sometimes argue the reason Jesus said nothing about it was because it would have been so obvious to all around that it was wrong that it didn't need saying. Which is equally just pure speculation. We're in danger here of filling the silence with our own presuppositions. Okay, there are also arguments which depend on particular passages which, people on both sides claim, show us what Jesus thought about homosexuality. These are the passages where Jesus talks about marriage, where Jesus talks about sexual immorality, and where Jesus heals a centurion slave. First of all, let's look at Jesus talking about marriage. The passage comes from Matthew chapter 19. There's a similar account in Mark chapter 10. Jesus is asked how easy divorce should be. Now, this was a current debate. One school of thought arguing that a man should be able to divorce his wife for any reason at all, whereas another school argued that he should only be able to divorce her in cases of sexual immorality. Jesus responds by going back to the account in Genesis. God made them male and female. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Let's be absolutely clear here. Jesus is addressing the permanence of marriage, not who you can marry. Now, of course, Jesus talks about male and female. Both he and his hearers lived in a world where that's who got married. In contrast, and in particular in Judaism at the time, same-sex marriage would not even have been a glimmer on the horizon of their conversation. So the passage deals directly with whether marriage should be lifelong, not whether same-sex marriages can be honouring to God. Jesus strongly affirms traditional marriage, but he doesn't therefore condemn all alternatives, including celibacy. The passage does not deal with same-sex marriage, and any attempts to make it so are arguing, again speculatively, from silence. These verses need careful unpacking and handling. Many Protestant churches hold that, in certain circumstances, remarriage after divorce is possible, and I agree with that. But you can't go from nuanced interpretations about the permanence of marriage, which the passage addresses directly, and then use the same passage as a blunt instrument to condemn same-sex marriage, which the passage doesn't address directly. It smacks of double standards. The second passage you may hear used comes from Mark chapter 7. Jesus proclaims it's not what goes into your body that defiles you, it's what comes from your heart. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. The Greek word translated as fornication is porneai, sexual immoralities. It's where we get words like pornography from. Now, some people have argued, and it ended up in an official Church of England document, that this plural form, porneai, would immediately lead any first century Jew to think of the list of forbidden offences in Leviticus 18 and 20, which include things like incest, bestiality, adultery, and male same-sex intercourse. This is wrong. First of all, there's no particular significance in the word being plural. All the sins mentioned in the list are plural. It's actually sexual immoralities, murders, adulteries, and so on. And that makes sense because Jesus is talking about the evil intentions, plural, that come from the heart. Secondly, a bit more on the word porneia, the singular form. It comes from the root porn, which refers to prostitution. So the word porneia would evoke sleeping with prostitutes in particular, or sleeping around more generally. It was also used within Judaism to refer metaphorically to idolatry. Why does Jesus add this "and adultery"? Because adultery was, legally, only sleeping with someone else's wife. Sleeping with a prostitute or a slave wasn't legally adultery. So Jesus is saying evil intentions include sleeping with other people's wives, adultery, or sleeping around more generally, porneia. The term porneia, or its Hebrew equivalent, weren't generally used by the rabbis when they talked about these sections of Leviticus. And in fact, some of the offences are specifically designated as not being porneia. So no one listening to Jesus, or listening to the gospel when it was first written, would have thought that Jesus was referring to homosexuality. So neither of these passages address our issue: loving, faithful, committed same-sex relationships. But what about the Centurion Servant? This is sometimes presented as Jesus healing a gay centurion's lover. The background to this is that Roman soldiers weren't allowed to marry whilst on active service. They had to wait until they retired. It wasn't uncommon for senior military officers, like a centurion, to have slaves, including boys, and sometimes to use the boy slaves for intercourse. In Luke 7, we're told of a centurion in Capernaum who has a highly valued slave close to death. The centurion asks Jesus to heal from a distance, trusting in Jesus' authority, and saying, "But only speak the word, and my boy," in Greek pais, "shall be healed." The word pais here can have multiple meanings. The slave may well have been a boy, but just as in the antebellum South in America, boy could mean any male slave. So, was this a gay centurion asking for healing for his lover? And does Jesus praising the centurion mean that he accepted gay relationships? I think that's reading too much into the passage in a number of ways. First, while it's historically plausible that the centurion was using his slave for intercourse, it's equally plausible he wasn't. Luke doesn't say enough for us to be able to tell. Secondly, even if he were, that doesn't mean that the centurion was gay. Now, I'm going to cover this more in future videos, but the ancient world didn't categorize sexuality by who you had sex with, but by whether you were the active dominant partner or the passive submissive partner. So the same man might have intercourse with a boy slave, with a female prostitute, and then with his wife, and the ancient Roman world would have seen that as perfectly normal and acceptable. So this centurion might have been using a boy slave, but might equally have been then expecting to marry on retirement from the army. And thirdly, this is not a relationship I want to appeal to or hold up anyway. It's not consensual, it's master-slave, it's inherently abusive. And so it's completely different to the type of relationships that we're talking about, committed, faithful, loving, same-sex relationships. Don't get me wrong, I think there's much in the Gospels which speaks indirectly about this issue. But there's nothing in the Gospels which speaks directly about being gay. There's more videos coming, so subscribe to the channel, and you can find more resources at bibleandhomosexuality.org. Thanks for watching.